Thank you. Good morning. I love people who show up for a 9 a.m. session about preventing factual errors. You're my kind of crazy. All right. I'm going to give you sort of an overview of why mistakes occur in the writing and editing process. We're going to look at the best tool known to humankind for actually preventing errors. It's free. You can create one yourself. I'll get you started in the process of doing that. And also give you a little bit of history sort of about, the mistakes that journalists tend to make, which is kind of a roadmap for the ones that you're probably already making or are going to make. And I say that with good humor because we all do make mistakes. It's nothing to be ashamed of, but of course it's something to work hard to try and prevent. So I also try to make this kind of an interactive session. So I will be asking you to participate. If you have questions, we'll certainly have time at the end, but feel free to jump up and ask a question at any time. Happy to take that. So the first thing that I request of all of you to start, you all have pen and paper on your table there in front of you. If you could just take a piece of paper and draw a line down the middle. We're going to use this to sort of get you going and get you started towards preventing errors. And the first thing that I want you to do on the left side of that piece of paper is to actually think about mistakes that you've made, or perhaps that your publication in general has made, and start actually writing down your errors there. So, and as I'm talking, things might trigger, oh yeah, that's right, we screwed that up too, sort of thing. So this is a place where you're going to capture the mistakes that you've made, that your publication has made. And my tip for sort of writing these down is to think about kind of the larger category of errors. So rather than saying, misspelled John Smith's name, you could say, misspelled names or something like that. So you don't need to keep repeating it if it's the same kind of error or category of error. So we'll keep capturing that as I talk. There's sort of 3 sections to this workshop. And each section I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story. So this is our first story here. And it starts kind of with the ending. I think most people are familiar with this image. It's probably the most iconic image of air, certainly in North America. And what's interesting about it is that all of the factors that conspired to cause that mistake and some other ones related to it are actually the same things that cause us to make mistakes every single day, all these decades later. And so the backstory on this, of course, this is Harry Truman. He won this presidential election. However, the Chicago Daily Tribune newspaper declared that he had actually lost. And this is a famous, famous photo. It was actually taken in St. Louis. Harry Truman was from Missouri. A couple days after the election, he was at the train station there, and he was on the back of a train talking to the crowd. Thousands of people there. They were clamoring over the gates to get in to see him before he was on his way back to Washington. And he held up this paper, and people were cheering. And what people actually don't know is he held up another publication after this one. And it was a copy of Billboard magazine. At that time, it was called The Billboard. And they were a weekly publication, as I think they still are now. And he held it up, and on the cover it had a headline, "Our Next President," and the picture was a singer holding a placard of Dewey. So the Tribune wasn't the only paper to make the mistake, but it became famous because of this photo. And what's interesting about it is, there is the element of the image that sort of made it iconic forever. But I love the story because of all the lessons it teaches us. So if we were sort of leading up to the election in 1948, and I was up here and this was a room full of kind of political experts and pollsters, we would all probably be agreeing that Dewey was going to win. It was the kind of thing where you could say almost the headline was written before the votes were tallied, and in this case, that was actually exactly what happened. So Dewey was ahead in the polls. All the pundits said he was going to win. All of the newspaper columnists said he was going to win. Truman was one of the few people who believed that he actually still had a chance. And so polls leading up to Election Day had Dewey very much comfortably in the lead. Nobody expected anything other than Dewey to be the next president. So on Election Day, there's about 6 daily papers in Chicago at the time. Chicago Daily Tribune, they're going to put out several editions that day, of course, because it's Election Day. They want to be on the street. They want to have the latest info. They come up to their first afternoon deadline. And the vote tallies are actually very slow coming in, even from the East Coast, where the polls are starting to close. And they realize, well, we can't really call anything at this point. So they put out kind of an equivocal headline. It goes on the street. Everything's fine. Another deadline comes, and they're starting to get a bit nervous because the vote tallies are more of them are coming in, but there's really not a conclusive call. But because they have all these competing papers, they sort of say, well, if we don't call it and they call it, then we're not going to sell any copies when we put them out on the street. So they called up their correspondent in Washington, and they asked him, what should we do? And he's like, well, listen, I mean, obviously we know Dewey's going to win, so it's just a matter of, counting the votes for what we know is going to happen. And they put out this headline. And went out, trucks delivered it, and then they saw their competitor papers. And nobody had put out a headline like this. They were all completely on their own. And so they actually sent the trucks back out, and they started literally pulling the newspapers off of the newsstands. And it became kind of a collector's item even on that day, because it was hard to find an intact edition like this one, because what they would do is they would rip off the masthead to sort of say that, okay, we gather back this copy, and the merchant wouldn't be charged for it. So this started to spread. The competitors the next day had a great time with it. They were making fun of them, and then it wasn't until a couple days later that this photo was taken, that it became really all that famous. And here's the interesting thing about it. This wasn't the only mistake they made that day. So this is a copy of the paper. I turned it upside down on purpose, I promise. So you have the incorrect headline, but I turned it upside down because if you actually read the story where they were reporting that Dewey had won, you would have seen that there were a couple of paragraphs of text upside down. So wrong headline, upside down text. Third thing is that if you looked at the vote totals on this page, the numbers were really garbled. So you could almost not really make out what the vote totals were, which was probably a good thing considering the vote totals pretty much showed that Truman was ahead in most of the places. So they have the incorrect headline, they have the garbled numbers, they have the upside down paragraphs. There's something going on at this paper that's really screwing things up this day. And the answer to sort of figuring out why things went wrong starts about a year before. And this is where they lose the people who operated, does anyone know what this machine is here? A linotype machine. When I go to journalism schools, the students have no idea what that thing is. They're like, what, that thing looks neat, but my God, it's huge. So it's a linotype machine. It was a wonderful invention, enabled you to quickly turn text on a page into blocks of type that can be put together to form a page and send off to the printer. So a year before Election Day, roughly, the people who ran and operated these machines went on strike. The pressmen went on strike. The linotype operators went on strike. And so this happened across all the papers in Chicago. And what that meant was they had to adapt and use different processes and different technologies. They had kind of different people putting the paper together. And they had a year to sort of figure out how they were going to do this. But then Election Day comes where there's much more pressure, where they're putting out much more editions. And suddenly all of these tensions start to erupt into big problems for them. And so what happens is they're actually putting together the paper, they're using typewriters to type out the columns of text, and then they're pasting them all together. So they don't have these machines. And what that means is somebody at one point pasted in numbers upside down, or pasted in text upside down. And when it came to those garbled numbers, if they had entered in vote totals and new numbers came in, and a 6 had become a 3, they just put that piece of paper back in the typewriter, and they hit 3 as hard as they could on top of the 6. And then, of course, there's the headline, which is a conscious decision to declare something that the facts actually don't tell you. So you see that it's not just a matter of a wrong decision. It's a matter of what are they using to source that decision. It's a matter of what are the tools they have on hand. What are the processes they're using to put together their publication. And who are the people that they have to actually do all these things. And those are the factors that start to conspire to create this really, really famous and iconic mistake. And they're actually the same factors that can play with us every single day in our own newsrooms. All right, so you have that other side of your piece of paper now. We've had our first sort of story about the background of why errors occur. What I want you to do on the right-hand side of your piece of paper is to think about any little tricks or tips that you do for yourself to stop you from making a mistake. And what I find is when I go into newsrooms or journalism schools or other places, people often have something that they've learned over time as a way to stop them from making mistakes. So I'll give you an example. I hear from a lot of people that when they're editing a piece of copy and it's on screen, they often blow up the font size or just magnify it so that rather than being 12 point, it's like the equivalent of 18 point, and they can really see it a lot better and actually spot things. So that's an example of a neat little trick that you can easily do to help you spot errors more easily when you're editing something. So again, just think about this as we're sort of going through each part of this. Do you have any tips? Do you know stuff that colleagues and viewers use? Put those down on the right-hand side, and of course on the left-hand side, keep thinking about all those wonderful mistakes you've made over the years. All right, so we've had our first story. Let's look at really focusing in on why errors occur. And to talk about that, I want to tell you a story about a man named James Reason. In the 1970s, he was a cognitive psychologist working in the UK. And he was at home one day. He had a cat who needed to be fed. and he was making some tea. And so he's opening up the tin of cat food. He's also got his water boiling. He's got his teapot there. And he opens up the tin of cat food, puts it in the cat dish, looks down and realizes, oh, he's actually put the cat food in the teapot. You know, a mistake that any of us can make, right? And so for him, this becomes like the apple hitting Isaac Newton on the head, which I know didn't happen, but just, you know, that sort of, that moment of inspiration. And so for him, he spends the next decades of his life examining why we make mistakes when we know what the actual correct thing is to do. He starts writing books with names like Human Error. He starts coming up with prevention strategies for error. He starts looking at why brain functions cause us to make mistakes. And his work ends up being used in nuclear power plants, in airplane cockpits, used in a wide variety of industries where it can often be literally life or death, whether you make a mistake or not. It's used, in fact, in so many industries that journalism kind of sticks out as one place where it's not really used. And that's what I'm going to tell you a little bit about today, with that sort of magical error prevention tool that I'm going to keep sneakily hinting at and not show you until the very, very end. I'm very cruel like that. So James Reason gives us a lot of background and really a theory of human error. And what we know, and this is a great quote from him, this was in the British Medical Journal, and so he writes, "It's often the best people who make the worst mistakes. Error is not the monopoly of an unfortunate few. Far from being random, mishaps tend to fall into recurrent patterns. So the same set of circumstances can provoke similar errors regardless of the people involved." I actually think this is a really liberating statement for journalists, for editors, for production people, for everybody involved in the process, because what it tells you is that you're not a bad person, you're not a bad professional if you make a mistake. And it's not just about us, it's not just about what's going on in our minds, it's not just about being pressed on deadline. There are actually outside factors that can all come together and cause us to make an error again and again and again. And one of our problems that we have is that we always think it's us. We always think, oh, I was tired or I was rushed. But it's important to look at the larger framework. And this is one of the great lessons from him, that it's not just about whether people are well-trained or not, or things like that. In fact, in some cases, experience is overrated because it can make you overconfident. Oh, I've been doing this for 30 years. I know what I'm doing. Well, it's actually out of your hands at some points. And if that doesn't make you feel liberated, I have this quote from a fact checker at Columbia Journalism Review who said, one of the most mistake-packed articles they've ever checked was written by a Pulitzer Prize winner. So we all make mistakes. There are certainly times where making the same kind of mistake over and over again may be a sign that you need some training, you need some extra assistance, fair enough. But all of us are prone to error, and it's not just because it's not just about us. So what are the big factors that cause error? The first one is certainly our brains. And in particular, for people who are dealing with the written word, it's how our brains process language. So be aware that sometimes your brain will literally be playing tricks on you. An example is that we often confuse opposites. So there's an example that I got from somebody who was a fact checker at Maclean's years ago. She said that a writer had called an actress Zaftig rather than calling her svelte, which he meant. And when he was called on it, he was like, oh my God, I can't believe I put Zaftig, which means kind of, nicely plump. And so this is a case where he knew exactly what he wanted to write, but his brain actually caused him to put in the opposite. So be aware that, when it comes to the things you're writing, the things you're doing, just like James Reason and the cat food, you will sometimes do something and you can't imagine why it's happening. So what we need to do is create processes and structures that actually help, backstop us and not just keep it in our brain. Another reason why errors occur are the tools and technologies we use. So this is the spell checker, which is an evil, evil, evil device. It's meant to help us. It's meant to improve the quality of the work we're doing. But it has its limitations. It can't tell you if a word is spelled correctly. It can't tell you if it doesn't actually belong in that sentence. And a good example is years ago, a newspaper in Australia was writing about Iraq when Saddam Hussein was still in power. They meant to call it a Ba'athist state. He was the leader of the Ba'ath Party. And spellcheck got a hold of that, didn't recognize Ba'athist, and so what they wrote was that Iraq was a bastard state in their newspaper. Spell checkers can certainly find and correct errors, but they can just as easily introduce them. So understand that the proverbial double-edged sword is always in play with the technologies we use. And understand that you may introduce something to improve your process, but just by introducing a new tool, you could also be introducing new errors, even if that tool is meant to prevent them. So think about when things change, when something new is introduced, that's when you might actually see new errors starting to occur. And that goes to the next point, which is this image of an old sort of smoky newsroom. The idea is the process that we use. You know, writer is assigned an article, writer produces article, goes to handling editor, from there, maybe to a copy editor, maybe to a fact checker, goes through production. At each one of these stages, you know, something is happening to prepare it for that eventual product online or in print. But at each of these stages, you're also trying to do an element of quality control. And the reality is that an editor can just as easily introduce an error as they can prevent one. And this happens all the time. You know, writers complain about it, and then of course, editors complain about how crappy the copy is when they first get it. And the point here is to realize that when you have a process, you're certainly trying to create one to avoid error. But at the same time, it is possible that people along that process will introduce an error. And if that error gets introduced, and you know that last stage before it goes to the printer, and I can see people starting to shake already as I remind them of this happening, you know, there's no backstop there. So that's the end of the process, it's gone off to the printer, and that error is in there. So realize that the process you use is tremendously important. How do the technologies work within that process? How do you backstop people with the technology and process to make sure that when their brain plays tricks on them, you catch it? And remember, when something changes with your technology or your process, this is when you need to be extra alert that you may actually be introducing new errors, or if you're actually paying attention, you may find that mistakes you were making before suddenly disappear because you've improved it. So keep that in mind. The process is very, very important. Another reason why errors occur, of course, are the sources we deal with every single day. People tell us something, we report it, maybe we don't check it out enough, and it ends up in print, and they were incorrect. Usually these people aren't trying to, you know, willfully mislead us. They're certainly trying to spin us. They're certainly giving information often with self-interest in mind, and that's understandable and normal. But we have to remember that our job is to apply that layer of verification before we go into that element of dissemination. So when we get information from sources, it's up to us to really double check it. That's why fact checkers have been such a tradition in magazines, even though I know they're on the decline. It's tough to justify that with budgets in a lot of places. But we need to be aware and really talk to the journalists and editors to make sure that they know, just because you can put something in quotes, it doesn't mean it's accurate, it doesn't mean it should go into our publication. So one other big kind of bucket reason why errors occur. Does anybody recognize this guy? Jason, that's good. You get half points.
Jayson.
That's right. You got, yes, the first name is spelled Jayson. Very good. Last name is Blair. He was the New York Times reporter who, you know, resigned in disgrace after having been found to plagiarize and then fabricated in a long string of articles going back. And side note, he's actually a life coach now, of all things, for sure. You know, he's trying to apply his lessons. But, you know, the message here isn't that Jayson Blair is, you know, a dangerous thing. But the reality is that sometimes the people we work with, and this is by far the most rare occurrence of mistakes, but sometimes the people we work with are consciously actually subverting the system. And this is why having controls in place like fact checkers and other things are good, because in every profession, it doesn't matter what it is, there are always bad actors. And so this isn't where your daily focus needs to be, but you also need to be aware that, you know, journalism I don't think has proven very good at spotting these people and catching them before something happens. Usually they've been plagiarizing and fabricating and then somebody calls them on it. It's not usually their own publication that catches it. So remember that this can be there, but hopefully with training and good oversight, you can avoid it. So those are the sort of larger causes of error. And you notice that, yes, there was one that was sort of ourselves, our brains, and things like that, but there's really that larger system in place. And this goes to James Reason's point that a same set of circumstances can create errors again and again. So let's think about errors in a sort of larger context as we're talking about this. And now, I'm looking for a volunteer here, because I'll confess to you that my handwriting is absolutely atrocious, and I have a lovely flip chart over here. So I'm looking for somebody who has decent enough handwriting who could come up and capture some of the things that we're going to talk about right now. So, okay, so no volunteer yet. I have a prize for you. All right, thank you, Joyce. There we go. All right, so what we're going to do now is that left-hand side of the page, you've started collecting some of the mistakes that you've made or that your publication has made. And what I want to do is for us to start capturing those and create a list. So we're going to create almost like a master list of all the screw-ups in the room, because chances are if somebody else has made that mistake, you will too. So who's got an error that they wrote down? Yeah?
This wasn't my personal mistake, but...
Yes, of course. We'll put that as a caveat on everyone's, right?
I killed someone off before they died.
Ah, yes, okay, killed someone off before they died. Now, this happens frequently enough that I've come up with a name for it. I call it obiticide, which is death by guillotine. It's really tremendously frequent. I dedicated a chapter to it in my book, in fact. So wonderful. Yeah, so declaring, and here's the thing about this error that's really good to remember, is all it takes is one word, or actually two words. So if you put the late in front of someone's name, they're dead, that's it, you know? And so this is a reminder of how much of an impact we can have when we use words in a certain way. So a great one, thank you. Who else has one here they want to share? Yes?
I don't think I skip the small words. The small words are the prepositions and things.
So skipping small words, skipping the prepositions and things, leaving those out and suddenly the sentence may not make sense or it may mean something else. Right. So we have that. Thank you, Joyce, putting it up there. Who else has got another one? Is that a hand? Yes.
Yeah, omission or incorrect credit for images.
Okay.
Important ones that this was supposed to be there and all rats, it's not.
So like messing up a cut line, forgetting a cut line or something like that as well?
Actually, like the site of a photo shoot is the thing I'm thinking of. The venue for the photo shoot, not credited.
Okay.
Yeah,
right. Or you can leave off the photographer as well, I suppose, sometimes, huh?
yes, sir.
Right. And I'll say that errors in cut lines and things like that, this is very common because I'm going to share with you a list of what research has told us about really common errors. So that one is certainly often there. Who else has one? I know we have more errors in the room. Don't be shy. Yes?
We often have errors in accents because the Quark Express that I do,
Oh, for you, you're still using Quark Express. Oh, God.
Yeah,
Oh, I do too.
that looks all right, and then the PDF looks all right, then I send it to the printer,
Right.
and I forget to recheck, and our printer sometimes doesn't come up with the right accents, and notably was 2 issues ago on the cover,
Oh.
Chesku, and I missed it.
That's a tough name anyway, huh? That's the kind of name where it's like, so I did this sort of small check when I was looking into the history of misspelled names. I was like, okay, so what's a really name that would be misspelled a lot? And I should have looked for that one. I started looking for misspellings, corrections to Engelbert Humperdinck, because I figured that's a name people might mess up. And I found no corrections for that, but tons of corrections for other names that you would think are a lot easier. So I find when something is harder, we're like, oh yeah, I need to double check that, but somebody gives their name as John Smith, there might be a Y instead of an I, and that's often what we'll miss. But that's good. So we have a combination where it's almost like it's a production error. It's almost the technologies, like an example of using that, but also of course missing something on the proofs of things like that. Who's got another one? Yes.
The wrong draft going forward.
Oh yeah, right. Right. Yeah. So again, that can often have a technology thing. Somebody clicks on the wrong one, but or sends the wrong one as well. Yeah. Right. That's always fun. You see like the editor's notes actually in print in there and everything. Yeah.
Just things that had been corrected didn't get corrected in print.
Yeah, no, that's pretty common. Who else has another one here? We got, yes?
You know if the text gets pushed up somehow, and then part of the text.
So it cuts off at the top of like the text box?
It's there, but
Right, yeah. So, and it's good, it sort of speaks to that cause of error of the tools that we use. We're seeing how they really, how they can befuddle us at times. You had one, yeah?
Yeah, American versus Canadian spelling.
That's a good one, yeah.
Spell check that, please.
That's right. Yeah, no, that's very good. That's a good one that we often encounter as well.
And just consistency in spelling, so getting it right all the way through.
Yeah, that's right. So so making sure you're applying your style guide correctly throughout, but even within a piece to spell something the same way. Yeah, please.
I have one. A factual mistake that through improper usage makes it into the very final draft of a story. The example I have would be, I was proofreading a piece in a literary magazine, and this is a high sensitivity for me because I am Irish. They use the expression Black Irish to describe a kind of rough and tumble Irish family.
Right.
That is not what Black Irish means.
Right.
But nobody in the process, because the writer didn't know, the editor didn't know, and it was me who caught it just because
Right.
I had the sensitivity.
So thinking that a term or a phrase means one thing when in fact it means something else. Yeah, that's common. And that's the kind of thing that, copy editors just love to dive in and say, so you think it means this, but no, it actually means that. I mean, I've had copy editors sort of school me on things like that all the time. Yes?
One of our faculty at the university, she just received her proof back, and the copy editor had changed racial to racist.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah. It's just the kind of thing where everybody, like, my face is probably getting red right now. It's like we can all feel that, right? Well, this is a great list. Does anyone else have one they want to throw up there? Yeah.
You already mentioned it, but directions. I've done it twice, and then right, and left, and north.
Directions. Yeah. No, that's good. Absolutely. Yeah. And did you have one at the table here in the front?
I actually have two.
Oh my! Wow.
We have a lot of contributing people to our magazine, and there's a lot of interns who write for us. So trying to edit their words without changing what they're saying.
Right.
I guess one of the errors that we have is misinterpreting context.
Right. Misinterpreting the context.
And
Yeah.
then the other one is using the wrong, like, your or their or
Right.
synonyms that we're using the wrong.
Forgetting the apostrophe, you're putting it where it shouldn't be.
Where it's like instead of Y-O apostrophe R-E, it's Y-O-U-R, those kinds of things.
Right. Yeah. So grammar and spelling, sort of course, these are things that we all tend to screw up. You had one back there as well.
Yeah, improper groupings. Until recently, I worked at a wine magazine, and we published a lot of lists. And one time, we published a list of the top 10 wines from Nova Scotia, but there was one from PEI in there, and
Right.
it was improperly listed. And the winery was very upset. So we have to
Yes.
double check our groupings and make sure that we categorize stuff correctly. Details.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you see that particularly when you're doing lists, which we all know are fun front of book items or, fun SEO attracting items for online. So, lists are more and more common, and miscategorizing something on a list, especially if you're going to do like a list of the worst of something, you really want to make sure you get those items right. So this is a great catalog of errors here. And what I would encourage you is, if you heard ones that weren't on your list, is to start adding them on that left-hand side. So you can grab those ones quickly, and then we'll flip over the chart and you can grab the other ones. Because, like I say, if somebody else has made these mistakes, thank you, Joyce. Excellent work, wonderful. If somebody else has made these mistakes, chances are you're going to as well. I mean, that's just the reality of it. We're all prone to these kinds of things, and since we're all sort of in the same business, chances are it's going to happen. So keep adding to that list on the left-hand side. Maybe some of these will trigger other thoughts for you. Keep doing that. And remember, on that right-hand side, you've got any tips or tricks or things like that that you use to prevent them. All right. So moving on, here's something else to add to that left-hand side. We actually have about 80 years of research into newspaper news accuracy in the United States. And here's the sort of punchline of it, is that these are, according to the surveys that have been done, the 11 most common mistakes that appear in United States newspapers in order of their frequency. So the most common mistake in newspapers are misquotes, according to this, incorrect headlines, and then we've got numerical errors. And this means math, but it also just means addresses and phone numbers. So when you have that process of checking through things, you want to call those phone numbers, you want to look up the address and things like that. An example on this is a few years ago, the Washington Post ran a story, had a phone number that was actually related to the White House. They messed up a digit or two, and it ended up going to a phone sex line. So that, and honestly, I've seen that happen a few times. So there is a law that if you mess up a phone number, it's going to a phone sex line. Keep that in mind, all right? So numerical errors, misspellings, obviously a large kind of catch-all category. Incorrect job titles, incorrect names. These are ones that drive us crazy, and they also drive the people that we talk to and the people that we quote crazy. Someone's name is very personal, it's very important to them, as is their job title, and there's no reason why we should be getting these things wrong, and yet we do it on a really frequent basis. And even like at the New York Times, they misspell names all the time, and this is a problem that befuddles them, and they're trying to get better at it, but it's really a big problem in journalism.
Could I add something to that? Double letters.
Double letters.
Yes.
Oh, right, okay. Yeah, so specifically, so like kind of the Scandinavian names, you mean?
Or
where
Italian,
they, Right, yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, you know, part of it is, and I'll give you, this is a tip you can add to your right-hand side right now. The best way to assure that you don't misspell someone's name in their title is when you're doing the interview, you start every single interview you do by asking them to spell their name and title. So you're creating a habit that forces you to collect this information, because I think they're usually misspelled when we just sort of, you know, look it up online later or what have you. You can also ask for their business card, which is usually a helpful thing. And the other part that's really good about starting every interview with asking for that is it shows that you care. It shows that accuracy matters to you. And I think what it really does is it helps put the source at ease. It's a good way to get started. You're showing that you care about accuracy. You're showing that you care about some of their personal details. So if you're really trying to stick it to them in the interview, that's a good way to get them off, you know, feeling good about it, right? So other ones, incorrect location. We talked about directions, but you know, locations in general. Incorrect time, incorrect date, incorrect address, incorrect age. When I look at this list, I see a huge amount of things that are very easily checked and very easily preventable. So that's kind of the good news. You know, the bad news is that we aren't doing it, but you know, the good news again is that I'm going to show you this magical error prevention tool. Are you getting really excited about it? Have I built it up enough that you're going to be tremendously disappointed when I tell you what it is? Because that's what usually happens. Okay. So, in terms of, now that we've collected these mistakes, now that we know the ones that you'll make, the ones that other journalists tend to make, one of the things that I really encourage people to do is, you know,